What if everything you were ever taught about the beginning of human civilization was not just incomplete, but fundamentally, catastrophically wrong? What if the entire timeline, the entire sequence of events that supposedly gave rise to religion, agriculture, writing, and society itself was built on a single, massive assumption that has now been shattered? There's a hill in southeastern Turkey. It has been sitting there for 12,000 years. And the closer scientists look at it, the more terrifying the truth becomes. Because this hill does not just rewrite history, it erases it. There's something deeply unsettling about a discovery that the more you understand it, the less you feel you know. Most breakthroughs in archaeology give you answers. They fill gaps. They close chapters. Göbekli Tepe does the opposite. Every new excavation season, every new scan of the ground, every new paper published in a peer-reviewed journal does not bring scientists closer to resolution. It drags them further into a mystery so vast, so structurally destabilizing to everything we have assumed about human prehistory, that some of the world's most respected researchers now speak about it in quiet, measured tones. The kind of tones people use when they are trying not to say something that will sound insane. This is not fringe speculation. This is not ancient aliens or internet mythology. What is happening at Göbekli Tepe right now, in 2025, backed by ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scanning, peer-reviewed astronomical research, and 5 straight months of excavation conducted by teams from Istanbul University, the German Archaeological Institute, and Berlin's Freie Universität, is something far more disturbing than fiction. It is the slow, methodical dismantling of the story we have been telling ourselves about who we are and how we got here. Let us start from the beginning. Not the beginning of the site, the beginning of the assumption. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists operated on a framework so widely accepted it barely needed stating. It went like this. Humans first developed agriculture, then settled into permanent communities, then built religious structures, then developed complex symbolic systems, and eventually, after all of that, created monumental architecture. This was the ladder. This was the sequence. First food, then faith. First survival, then sophistication. It seemed logical. It seemed inevitable. Every major ancient civilization we had ever studied appeared to confirm it. Then someone dug into a hill in southeastern Turkey, and the ladder collapsed. Göbekli Tepe was built by groups of hunter-gatherers in the pre-pottery Neolithic period between 9,600 and 8,200 BCE. Read that again. These were people we have always classified as nomadic, people without farming, without pottery, without metal tools, without any of the prerequisites we assumed were necessary for organized, large-scale construction. And yet they built something that should not exist, something that, according to every model we had, could not exist. The enormous T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe, some reaching heights of up to 5.5 meters, are the oldest examples of monumental architecture discovered to date. These pillars were carved from flint at a time when metal tools were not yet used. Think about what that means. 5.5 meters, carved from limestone, transported from quarries, arranged in precise circular formations by people who were supposed to be wandering the land in search of food, people who, according to the old model, should not have had the social organization, the surplus resources, the collective planning, or the symbolic motivation to build anything more complex than a shelter. And yet, here it is, standing, massive, undeniable. But here's where it gets worse. The site was not just built. It was built with a level of geometric precision that has stunned modern researchers. This was implied by the identification of a geometric pattern based on an equilateral triangle that regulated the position of the 3 enclosures and their architectural elements. According to researcher Hackley, the equilateral triangle was built using 3 T-shaped pillars that align almost perfectly, connecting 3 temple-like enclosures. The builders may have stretched a piece of rope to the desired shape before constructing the columns to ensure their accuracy. A rope, 12,000 years ago, used to measure and execute geometric precision that modern architects would recognize and respect. This is not primitive behavior. This is not the behavior of a species stumbling blindly toward civilization. This is deliberate. This is calculated. This is something else entirely. And this is where everything changes. Because the new research emerging from Göbekli Tepe is not simply adding details to a known story, it is revealing an entirely different story, one with layers so deep and implications so staggering that mainstream archaeology is still struggling to absorb them. The findings released in 2024 and confirmed through the 2025 excavation season have cracked open a set of questions that the old framework simply has no language to answer. Start with the carvings. For years, the animal imagery carved into the T-shaped pillars, foxes, vultures, snakes, scorpions, boars, lions, was interpreted as ritual decoration. Symbolic, yes, meaningful certainly, but decorative in nature. The latest research is suggesting something far more sophisticated. The enclosures appear to follow intentional geometric layouts. Pillars align in ways that hint at advanced spatial understanding. Animal carvings, foxes, vultures, snakes, boars, aren't scattered decoration. They may follow symbolic patterns or narrative sequencing. Narrative sequencing. Let that sink in. The idea that the animal imagery on these pillars follows a sequence, a deliberate order, a story being told, means we are not looking at decoration. We are looking at communication. We are looking at a people who encoded information into stone with such precision and intentionality that 12,000 years later, we are only now beginning to decode it. And the message they left behind is one that nobody was prepared to receive. Because what the carvings on Pillar 43 appear to show is not just a scene, it is a record, a document, a piece of information preserved in stone with a specific intention that it would survive, that it would be understood, that it would outlast the people who carved it and the civilization they came from. The findings at Göbekli Tepe suggest that ancient humans could record astronomical events with remarkable accuracy, even employing the concept of precession, the wobble of the Earth's axis that affects the movement of constellations across the sky. This insight predates the known documentation of precession by the Greek astronomer Hipparchus in 150 BCE by over 10,000 years. Over 10,000 years, the Greek astronomer Hipparchus is credited in every standard history textbook as the man who documented the precession of the equinoxes in approximately 150 BCE. That discovery has been celebrated as one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world, and the people of Göbekli Tepe understood it more than 10 millennia before him. They did not just understand it, they encoded it in stone, in a form designed to be read by anyone with enough intelligence to look. What most people are not seeing is the full weight of that statement. We are not talking about a civilization that was slightly more advanced than we assumed. We are talking about a civilization, or a group of civilizations, a network of knowledge, that possessed astronomical understanding so sophisticated it was not rediscovered by the Western world until the 2nd century BCE. The gap between what we were told and what we are now finding is not a small revision. It is an earthquake running directly beneath the foundation of human history. And then Dr. Martin Sweatman published his paper. In July 2024, Dr. Sweatman of the University of Edinburgh released a study in the journal Time and Mind that electrified the academic world and disturbed it in equal measure. The study showed how V symbols on Pillar 43 in enclosure D can be interpreted in terms of a lunar-solar calendar system with 11 epigomenal days, which would make it the oldest known example of its type. The oldest known calendar system in human history, not a rough approximation, not a seasonal marker scratched into bone, a lunar-solar calendar tracking both the cycles of the moon and the solar year simultaneously, encoded into stone with mathematical precision. The calendar is written using geometric symbols and corresponds to 12 lunar cycles plus 10 additional days, which adds to 364 days. The missing day, which completes the solar year, is interpreted to be the date written on the pillar. Think about what that means. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not simply observe the sky. They built a mathematical system to track it. They understood the relationship between lunar cycles and solar years with enough precision to design a calendar that required arithmetic to construct. Pillar 43 appears to use constants of nature, the lunar and solar cycles, to ensure its message cannot be misunderstood, incorporating the earliest evidence yet of arithmetic. The earliest evidence of arithmetic, in stone, 12,000 years ago, before Sumer, before Egypt, before anything we have ever called a civilization. But here's where it gets darker. Because Sweatman's research does not stop at the calendar. The calendar was not built to celebrate the seasons or mark the agricultural cycle. It was not a farmer's almanac carved in stone. According to the research, the calendar appears to have been built to remember something catastrophic, something so world-altering that the people who survived it felt compelled to carve it into the hardest material they could find and bury it under the earth to preserve it. Researchers believe that the calendar was carved to memorialize a devastating comet strike around 10,150 BCE, which triggered a 100-year mini ice age. This comet strike is thought to have wiped out many large animal species and caused significant environmental changes that may have spurred the transition from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to agriculture in the Fertile Crescent of West Asia. A comet around 10,850 BCE, an event that triggered what geologists call the Younger Dryas, a sudden catastrophic return to ice age conditions that lasted over 1,000 years, an event that wiped out entire species of megafauna across multiple continents, an event that reshaped the entire ecological landscape of the planet. And according to the research on Pillar 43, the people of Göbekli Tepe did not just survive it, they documented it, they built a monument to it. They encoded its date into stone using a mathematical calendar system, and preserved that message underground for 12 millennia, until we were advanced enough to find it and finally smart enough to read it. This is not chaos, this is memory. And the comet theory is not simply one researcher's interpretation. The Göbekli Tepe calendar was developed to record the date when some researchers suggest a comet hit the Earth some 13,000 years ago, ushering in a return to Ice Age conditions for over 1,000 years, an era known as the Younger Dryas. Independent physical evidence for this event has been accumulating for years. Platinum deposits in North American soil, nanodiamond particles found in Greenland ice cores, sediment layers across 4 continents showing a sudden catastrophic disruption at approximately the same date. The physical evidence of the catastrophe exists in the geological record, and the cultural memory of it exists in stone at Göbekli Tepe, 2 independent lines of evidence pointing to the same moment in time. Now consider the implications. If the people who built Göbekli Tepe were survivors of or witnesses to a civilization-ending cosmic catastrophe, if the entire construction effort at this site was in some sense an act of memorial, of record-keeping, of making sure that whatever knowledge they possessed would not be lost again the way it was almost lost by the comet, then we are not looking at the beginning of human civilization. We may be looking at the aftermath of one. According to informed sources in the research community, this possibility is increasingly difficult to dismiss, but the calendar and the comet are only 2 threads in a much larger tapestry. Let us talk about what is still buried, because this is perhaps the most quietly terrifying fact about Göbekli Tepe that almost nobody is discussing with the urgency it deserves. So far, only about 10% of the Göbekli Tepe site has been excavated, and it is likely to take around 150 years to excavate the full site. Archaeologists estimate that there are still 15 more enclosures buried underground, one of which could be up to 15,000 years old, built around 13,000 BCE. 15,000 years old, not 12,000. 15,000. That would predate the end of the last ice age. That would push the origin of organized, monumental, geometrically precise construction back into a period when, according to every conventional model of prehistory, humans were struggling to survive glacial conditions on a planet being ravaged by environmental collapse. And somewhere beneath the hill at Göbekli Tepe, that structure may be waiting. The real story is that we have excavated 1/10 of this site, 1/10, and already it has destroyed the foundational assumptions of our field. The question that nobody wants to say out loud is this: what is going to happen when we excavate the rest? Let us now talk about the 2025 season, because the findings from the most recent excavation are not just significant, they are, in the language of the researchers themselves, entering an entirely new phase of understanding. One of the most notable discoveries of the 2025 season was a human statue featuring clearly defined head and torso characteristics, unearthed between enclosures B and D, drawing widespread attention from the global archaeological community. This find comes in a sequence of escalating sculptural discoveries that are fundamentally changing the picture of who these builders were. 2 years earlier, a life-sized wild boar statue had been found in enclosure D, not a carved pillar, not an abstract symbol, but a figurative, 3-dimensional sculpture of an animal painted in red, white, and black pigments, complete with tusks and a tongue, approximately 1.35 meters wide. Researchers hypothesize that this painted boar statue may have symbolized the transition of the spirit into the afterlife. And now a human figure. Realistic, defined, clearly anthropomorphic, between 2 of the primary enclosures, as if placed deliberately at a threshold. What does it represent? A deity, an ancestor, a king, a shaman, a composite figure from a mythology so ancient we have no reference point for it? The honest answer, which archaeologists will give you if you press them, is this: we do not know. We do not have a category for it yet. But here is what we do know. Archaeologists at Göbekli Tepe have discovered traces of rectangular plant structures believed to have served as dwellings, expanding the understanding of daily life at the site. The discovery came from subsurface research involving geomagnetic, ground-penetrating radar, and LiDAR scanning to map buried architecture. The newly detected buildings are concentrated mainly on the eastern and southern slopes of the mound. People lived here. This is no longer a matter of debate. For decades, the dominant interpretation was that Göbekli Tepe was a pilgrimage site, a sacred place that people traveled to for ritual gatherings and then left. A temple complex in the wilderness, visited by nomadic groups who came together to perform ceremonies and then dispersed back into the landscape. That interpretation has now been overturned. Recent excavations have revealed tools, grinding stones, and plant and animal remains, indicating that people may have lived or stayed there for extended periods. The latest discoveries challenge earlier theory, as evidence of grinding mills, flint sickles, and plant residues suggests that its builders may have engaged in early farming or food processing. Farming. At a site that predates what we call the agricultural revolution, think carefully about the sequence this creates. If people were living at Göbekli Tepe, processing grain and managing food resources, while simultaneously constructing geometrically precise enclosures aligned to astronomical phenomena, decorated with narrative animal carvings, and encoding mathematical calendar systems in stone. Then the story is not that religion came before agriculture. The story is that complex symbolic thinking, astronomical knowledge, social organization, and food production all emerged together, simultaneously from the same community at the same moment, as part of the same civilizational impulse. They were not sequential steps on a ladder. They were facets of a single integrated human project, and that project was launched 12,000 years ago on a hill in southeastern Turkey that we have only barely begun to excavate. This is not just surprising, this is revolutionary, and here is the part that no one in the mainstream conversation is adequately emphasizing. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BCE is one of the strangest and most significant acts in all of human prehistory. The fill material in the layer 3 enclosures is a complex mixture containing worked flint, animal bone fragments, broken stone vessels, and limestone chunks and chips. The enclosures were not abandoned and forgotten. They were decommissioned, shut down, covered over, and sealed away. This was not erosion. This was not collapse. This was not the gradual accumulation of debris over centuries of neglect. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous. The layer 3 monumental enclosures were deliberately filled with a mixture of limestone rubble, soil, animal bones, and flint fragments. This is not erosion or flood deposition. The fill composition, stratigraphy, and volume all point to intentional human action. The debate is about why, not whether. The scale tells us it was a substantial project. The fill of a single major enclosure amounts to hundreds of cubic meters of material. Not a single-day ceremony, but an organized, probably communal undertaking that may have unfolded over weeks or longer. Hundreds of cubic meters of material, deliberately moved and placed with care over the course of weeks or months by a large organized community to seal enclosures they had spent generations constructing. Why? What do you do when you want to end something and preserve it at the same time? What do you do when you want to close a chapter but ensure the chapter survives? You bury it. According to informed sources in the archaeological community, this act of deliberate burial may be the most important clue we have about how the people of Göbekli Tepe understood their own project. They were not simply destroying something. They were not fleeing. They were performing an act of preservation through concealment. They were, in a very real sense, doing exactly what a civilization does when it wants to send a message forward through time. They were creating a time capsule, and 12,000 years later we are opening it. But here is what we are finding inside that capsule that should make every one of us stop and reconsider the scale of what we are dealing with. The astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe are not confined to Pillar 43 and the calendar inscriptions. They run through the entire architecture of the site. Out of 54 stone pillars, 9 are oriented approximately east-west, 4 are in the most northerly and southerly moonrise and moonset directions at a minor lunar standstill, and 10 are in the most northerly and southerly moonrise and moonset directions at a major lunar standstill. This is not coincidence. This is not the accidental product of a community placing stones wherever it was convenient. This is a site-wide astronomical orientation scheme, a facility designed to track celestial events across an entire landscape, with the positions of individual pillars encoding specific astronomical alignments the way the hands of a clock encode time. A slab embedded in the wall of enclosure D includes carvings aligned with the winter solstice sunrise. Alignments were verified using astronomical simulations for 9500 BCE, the winter solstice, the most symbolically and practically significant astronomical event in the lives of any pre-agricultural people. The moment the sun reaches its lowest point and begins, imperceptibly, to return. The moment that represents death and rebirth, darkness and the promise of light, the end of one cycle and the beginning of the next. The builders of Göbekli Tepe carved that moment into the wall. They designed the architecture of their enclosure to frame it, to catch it, to hold it in stone, and then they buried it. What most people are not seeing is that this speaks to a level of planning that goes beyond ritual. It speaks to intention. It speaks to legacy. Someone at Göbekli Tepe, some community, some tradition, some school of knowledge, was thinking about the future. Not the next season, not the next generation, but a future so far distant that they could not possibly have imagined it. A future 12,000 years away. A future that turns out to be us. Now let us bring all of this into the sharpest possible focus. Because the question that hangs over all of this research, the question that grows more urgent with every new scan, every new paper, every new statue pulled from the Earth, is not simply what did they know. The question is, where did they learn it? A luni-solar calendar system requires years, likely generations, of systematic sky observation. The mathematical encoding of precession of the equinoxes requires tracking the slow, roughly 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's axis against the backdrop of the stars, a phenomenon that takes centuries of dedicated observation to even detect, let alone calculate and encode. The geometric precision of the enclosures requires not just practical engineering skill, but an abstract mathematical understanding that, in the conventional timeline, should not have existed for another 8 to 10,000 years. And the carvings. The animal imagery, the symbolic narrative sequences, the V symbols and H symbols, and the serpent motifs found on a 2.8-meter stone slab suggest a rich, layered, sophisticated symbolic language that was clearly not invented at Göbekli Tepe, but was instead carried there, as if it already existed, as if it came from somewhere older. The real story is that Göbekli Tepe may not be the beginning of anything. It may be the last remnant of something that came before. And that something, whatever it was more sophisticated than anything we have been taught to expect from that era of human history. Dr. Sweatman said, "This event might have triggered civilization by initiating a new religion and by motivating developments in agriculture to cope with the cold climate. Possibly, their attempts to record what they saw are the first steps towards the development of writing millennia later. The first steps toward writing. Not drawing, not decoration, not primitive mark-making. The intentional encoding of complex information in a durable medium for the purpose of transmitting that information across time. That is what writing is. It appears to have begun not in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, as the textbooks state, but on the carved limestone pillars of Göbekli Tepe more than 12,000 years ago. The scale of the revision required by these findings cannot be overstated. Every timeline in every textbook that teaches the history of human civilization places the emergence of complex symbolic systems, mathematical understanding, astronomical knowledge, monumental architecture, and organized religion in the period between 6000 and 3000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe places all of those things before 9600 BCE. That is not a small correction. That is not an asterisk in the footnotes. That is the complete erasure of everything we thought was the beginning, and the revelation that the beginning was somewhere further back, much, much further back, in the dark and largely unexamined depths of prehistory. And now consider the sister sites, because Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Recent discoveries at Karahan Tepe, a nearby site with similar structures, support new theories about early civilization. Archaeologists recently uncovered a 2.45-meter human statue, the largest known from this period, featuring realistic facial details, firmly attached to a bench, providing a glimpse into prehistoric artistic traditions. Karahan Tepe, Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills Project, is a Turkish government-coordinated initiative that has now identified more than a dozen Neolithic sites in the same region of southeastern Turkey, all sharing architectural and symbolic similarities with Göbekli Tepe. Sayburç, Yeni Mahalle, Karahan Tepe. Each one is revealing traces of the same and sophisticated civilization. Each one is pushing back the timeline further, complicating the picture more, and making the old model harder to defend. At Karahan Tepe, researchers found an 11-pillar pool structure that mirrors the same lunar-solar calendar encoding found at Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe's 11-pillar enclosures and a megalithic 11-pillar pool structure at nearby Karahan Tepe can also be interpreted in terms of the same lunar-solar calendar system. The same system, at a different site. This is not one eccentric genius carving secret knowledge into a single pillar in the desert. This is a shared intellectual tradition, a knowledge system that was known across an entire region, practiced by multiple communities, encoded into architecture at multiple sites, and preserved with what can only be described as civilizational determination. This is not the behavior of people who are at the beginning of knowledge. This is the behavior of people who are desperately preserving it. Now we arrive at the 2025 excavation data and the ground-penetrating radar findings that are quietly reshaping the research agenda at the site. The work involved geomagnetic ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR scanning to map buried architecture. The newly detected buildings are concentrated mainly on the eastern and southern slopes of the mound. The removal of olive trees earlier this year allowed researchers to perform full-scale measurements for the first time, helping define the site's boundaries. The site's full boundaries are only now being understood. For 3 decades, excavation focused on the monumental enclosures at the hilltop. The 2025 scanning has revealed that the site extends significantly onto the slopes, that what we excavated was the ceremonial peak of a much larger settlement complex. The rectangular dwelling structures being detected are not peripheral curiosities. They are evidence of a community living in organized residential architecture surrounding the monumental structures at the center. This is a city, not in the sense of the stone cities of later antiquity, but in the most essential sense, a place where a significant human community lived, organized its resources, practiced its knowledge systems, managed its food production, and maintained its cosmological traditions across generations. A city without writing, without metal, without the wheel, and yet a city that understood the precession of the equinoxes encoded lunar-solar mathematics in stone, aligned its architecture to solstice sunrises, and built structures so massive they required the coordinated labor of hundreds of people, organized by a social system sophisticated enough to sustain that effort over decades. Nothing about this makes sense within the framework we were given, and that is exactly the point. Because the framework was always based on an assumption that complexity is the product of time, that human intelligence and organizational capacity accumulated gradually, step by step, tool by tool, idea by idea, over the course of tens of thousands of years in a straight line from simple to sophisticated. Göbekli Tepe does not fit that line. It does not fit on the trajectory. It appears fully formed, fully sophisticated, fully intentional, at a moment in history when it should not exist. What most people are not seeing is that this is not an anomaly to be explained away. It is a signal. It is the ancient world telling us something about itself that we have not been listening to. That the story of human intelligence is not a straight line from primitive to advanced. That at some point in the deep past, long before the empires and cities we celebrate as the cradle of civilization, there was a level of human understanding and capability that we have no record of and barely any evidence for, because most of that evidence is still buried, and 90% of Göbekli Tepe is still in the ground. Think about what that means. We have turned over 1/10 of the site, and already the discipline of archaeology is struggling to contain the implications. 15 more enclosures are buried beneath the hillside, mapped by radar but not yet touched by a trowel. One of those enclosures may date to 13,000 BCE, before the comet impact, before the Younger Dryas, before everything we currently point to as the trigger of human civilization. What is in that enclosure? What knowledge was encoded there? What story was the community of Göbekli Tepe trying to tell in those years at the edge of a world-ending catastrophe, carving stone in the darkness? And there is still the deepest question of all, the one that the burial event raises and refuses to answer. Around 8,000 BCE, after centuries of construction and use, the community at Göbekli Tepe chose to bury their greatest achievement. Not destroy it, bury it, with care, with organization, with intent. They filled the enclosures with hundreds of cubic meters of carefully selected debris, sealed the pillars, preserved the carvings, and walked away. Or perhaps they did not walk away. Perhaps they stayed. And what they buried was not the place, but the phase, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. Perhaps the burial was the ritual ending of one kind of knowledge and the beginning of what would eventually become agriculture, settlement, language, and eventually writing. Perhaps what we call the beginning of civilization was actually a transition, a moment when a community that had preserved the knowledge of a pre-catastrophe world decided that the time for preservation was over and the time for application had come. And perhaps what they built at Göbekli Tepe was not a temple in the way we understand temples, but a library, an archive. A structure designed not for worship in the conventional sense, but for the storage and transmission of knowledge across the one medium that can survive 12,000 years of wind, rain, and time: stone. If that is true, and the evidence accumulating from this site makes it increasingly difficult to argue that it is not, then the history of human civilization as we know it is not a history at all. It is a chapter, a late chapter, and the chapters that came before it are still mostly buried in a hillside in southeastern Turkey, waiting for us to find them. At least 15 more enclosures lie buried. One may date to 15,000 BCE. One may date to 15,000 BCE. Before the last ice age ended, before the comet struck, before the Younger Dryas froze the world, before the megafauna extinctions, before everything. If that enclosure exists, and the radar data suggests it does, then somewhere beneath the surface of this hill is a structure built by people living in the pre-catastrophe world, encoding knowledge of a civilization we have not yet found and may never fully understand. The question is no longer whether Göbekli Tepe rewrites history. It does. The only real question now is how much history it rewrites and how far back the rewriting goes. Every excavation season, the answer gets larger. Every new scan reveals more buried architecture. Every new paper extends the astronomical knowledge further back. Every new statue raises a new question about identity, belief, and social organization that the old models cannot answer. Something was here before everything we call the beginning. Something built monuments to survive catastrophe. Something encoded astronomical mathematics in stone to outlast the people who understood it. Something deliberately buried its greatest achievement in an act that reads, across 12,000 years, less like an ending and more like a message. We found the message. We are still learning to read it. And somewhere in the 90% of Göbekli Tepe that no archaeologist has yet touched, the rest of that message is waiting. The question is not what they knew. The question is what else they knew that we have not found yet. The question is what came before the oldest thing we have ever found. The question is whether the story of human civilization is as old as we think it is, or whether what we call civilization is simply the most recent attempt by a species with a very long and largely forgotten history to rebuild what it once impossibly had. And the hill is still 9/10 full.